Is the world confronting an illiberal moment? Many democratic societies around the world are being faced with challenges from both the left and the right against the very idea of liberal democracy itself. At the same time, many governments have adopted extraordinary powers in order to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Can liberalism survive these threats? Well, joining me to discuss is Martin van Staden. He is a legal researcher and well-known commentator with the business group Sakeliga. Martin van Staden, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara. Could we first start off with what is your assessment of the state of liberalism at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, if you compare the world that we have today to, I guess, the world in the 1950s or 60s, we are still a remarkably free and liberal place. So I don't want us to necessarily get into the doom and gloom of its tyranny and totalitarianism abounds. So I think we're still largely in a good place, but it's worsening, obviously, and that's been happening, I guess, for a while now. It's not only with the COVID-19 lockdowns, but I guess for about a decade now. Or I guess a little bit longer than a decade, what would traditionally be called the left has morphed, and I think this came after the Cold War ended formally in the beginning of the 1990s, where the left morphed into this call it the peaceful movement. There is no longer authoritarian communism and gulags, but more of a seditious type of intellectual movement, and we've seen this in our universities. We're seeing it in our schools. The IRR is running a very good critical race theory project now, which aims to analyze the extent to which this has came up in South African schools, and I know it's happened elsewhere. But this is just a symptom of an intellectual left, which has almost liberal democratized socialism. And we've seen that increase around the world. In South Africa, we've seen a very insidious race-based policy after the end of apartheid that's really been kind of a part of this left, the democratized leftism, with Black economic empowerment and affirmative action, where in the name of liberal democracy almost, private firms are forced to toe some ideological or social engineering line. Now, this has been going on for quite a while, and it's been sapping liberalism or the liberal constitutional order that the world has really known to a lesser and larger extent since the end of the Second World War, of its lifeblood. And quite predictably, the right wasn't very happy about this. And for the last decade but it kind of reached a peak around 2015, 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump and the Brexit phenomenon in the UK. And those two phenomena are still carrying on now. The right these words are very malleable, but call it the right, conservatives, populists, etc., really reacted to this insidious leftism. And that left liberals, I think, like ourselves, in a very difficult position, to say the least, because liberalism doesn't really neatly fit either on the left or the right. Liberals say, listen, leave people alone to do what they want on their property, to be free individuals, be free communities, freedom of association. And we have some overlap of the left and some overlap of the right. That doesn't make us fence sitters in the middle of the two necessarily, just there are some commonalities. But that put us in a very difficult position because these two extremes are now really at war here, even though they also have similarities. And that really has put liberal democracy in a difficult place, especially since the left has rejected it, and now the right has rejected it as well because of its so-called inability to stop this insidious leftism. And now, as the cherry on top, over the last 2 years, we got the COVID-19 pandemic and the extremely authoritarian lockdowns on top of that. So we've now just added all of these forces and this massive peak in government power into one pot, and it's not a great dish that's being made in there. So yes, in certain ways, liberals have it the hardest now, I think, than they've had in quite a few years. And at the job that we need to do to convince people that freedom really is the best recipe for any society, for any community to prosper. But also, it's a great opportunity because authoritarianism is so in your face right now. It's not even that subtle anymore. So we have a great opportunity to persuade and to educate with reference to the real lived reality that billions of people right now are experiencing. And I think in South Africa, it might be even more acute, because you can add the incompetence of the ANC, which is now bankrupt, and it's facing a terrible election defeat potentially in November. So this is actually a great opportunity, but it's also a very difficult time for those of us who love liberty.
Well, what you just said reminds me of the title of my colleague John Cain Berman's book called Between Two Fires. And I think that's a very appropriate metaphor for where we as classical liberals are at the moment, because you have this resurgent leftism around identity politics and critical race theory, as you mentioned. But then you also have growing arguments for a kind of a reactionary conservatism. And I think these things tend to oscillate on a spectrum, depending on events and trends of history. But I think classical liberals have a very neatly defined set of principles: the rule of law, respect for individual rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, that really kind of roots them in a very particular ideological tradition, and which, these are tools that you can use to understand the world and how to navigate through complexity. So Martin, you mentioned COVID, and obviously that's been an extraordinary set of events. COVID powers have been used by governments to justify all sorts of incursions on individual freedom. And do you want to speak about what you're seeing at the moment in terms of the COVID response, lockdown response, both here in South Africa, but also abroad?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very difficult. I don't recall liberals facing this issue to quite this extent in the last, I guess, century. There was a Spanish flu, but I'm not entirely sure how the world reacted to that, and whether it was quite this, for lack of a better word, this totalitarian, this totalizing. I don't think so. But it was difficult, and I give people the benefit of the doubt during March of last year. I had doubts. I did not know what the answer is to this pandemic, to this virus that is so easily transferable. I did not know. So for at least a while, I gave the South African government, and this has really been a standard response around the world to greater and lesser extents. South Africa had one of the hardest lockdowns, but I gave our government the benefit of the doubt and said, okay, it's unclear what the answer is here. It's definitely unclear. But it became clearer quicker than one would have imagined. And that is when South African citizens were being beaten to death by soldiers for drinking beer in their own yards, when people were being shot, when soldiers made people roll around in the grass to humiliate them into complying with the lockdown, when ministers banned sandals from being sold, baby clothing from being sold at stores, but other things could be sold. And as someone who has written quite a bit about the rule of law, this was really an in-your-face type of arbitrariness. It wasn't just saying, listen, nightclubs are closed now because people are rubbing against each other, dancing and so on, and laughing and spitting on each other. So that, I guess, yes, you can understand that to an extent. But saying that you can't buy a warm garage pie in a ordinary filling station convenience store, that takes the cake. And we're now past that to a large extent, thankfully. I'm not sure that the rest of the world joined us in this level of arbitrariness. With some mask mandates around the world, you do see it still. This idea that if you're 2 meters apart, then you're safe. But at a restaurant, when you're sitting down, you're obviously not 2 meters apart anymore, and you're allowed to take off your mask. Suddenly, you're still apparently safe, but that contradicts the previous the general principle that they've tried to set. So there's a hell of a lot of arbitrariness involved in this whole story, and that became obvious quite quickly. And the liberal answer then became quite clear, and that was that, okay, government has tried to respond to this. We've given it the opportunity to respond to this. It has shown us that it cannot respond to this in any type of liberal way. And as you mentioned, classical liberals or liberals in general have a very specific approach to governance. We have relatively timeless principles that don't simply change on account of the given reality. Since John Locke, who could be seen as the intellectual pioneer of liberalism, who brought together a bunch of ideas and said, this is liberalism, we've had pretty standard set principles: limited government, respect for life, liberty, and property, the rule of law, constitutionalism, a free market. These have been liberal principles since the 1600s, and they remain liberal principles today, no matter what some naysayers and progressives might say. But we now realize that these principles each of them were being violated in an epic fashion by government here in South Africa and around the world. And that the answer, at least as far as I am concerned, and there are liberals who disagree with me on this, is that government needs to now step back. It needs to abolish all lockdown restrictions. It can still do its educational and informational role and tell people about the risks of COVID, etc. That's fine. But the deprivations of liberty and individual rights needs to stop. And I've been convinced of this for quite a while now. I believe Denmark and the UK, to a greater and lesser extent, are getting rid of their lockdowns. I know Sweden has never had a hard lockdown since the pandemic began. I know some other societies did that without their populations being totally decimated. So it is possible to respond to this in a liberal way. The world decided not to go with the liberal way. So the answer is the time has now come. Vaccinated or unvaccinated, government needs to stop now, because we're setting precedents that it's going to be very difficult to roll back. I think those principles have already been set, and we are going to already have a hard time rolling it back.
Okay, so Martin, one of the more recent developments is around the vaccine and governments pushing to impose vaccine mandates on their citizens. And you've written a piece in the Daily Friend saying that this is fundamentally illiberal. And you were responding to another piece. And we're recording on Tuesday, the 14th of September, before your debate with some of your interlocutors there. What were some of the arguments that you made in that Daily Friend piece, which we'll link to in the description below?
So I made two broad arguments to respond to two broad arguments that those who favor vaccine mandates and vaccine passports made. So briefly, what my opponents, who I regard as very good liberals and so on, very good friends, so I don't want this to be interpreted as this great fight, but the essence of their argument, firstly, is that the harm principle, mostly associated with John Stuart Mill, is applicable in this case, and that individuals who are unvaccinated pose a real and immediate risk to the liberty of those around them. And if they're not vaccinated, they are in fact infringing upon the individual rights and the lives of those around them. And that's the meta liberal philosophical argument in favor of a vaccine mandate. Now, the more practical argument, I guess, specifically in the South African context, is that we now have this lockdown, this draconian lockdown, and that is, we are all agreed, is a terrible deprivation and an unjustifiable deprivation of individual rights. But the best way to get out of that lockdown is to vaccinate as widely as possible, even vaccinate completely the entire population, and then the lockdown can stop because the risk will then be significantly decreased, if not entirely eliminated. Those are the two broad arguments. Now, my response to that was, in the first place, that I think the harm principle is doing some heavy lifting that it was never meant to do in this context, and it's something we need to be careful about. When John Stuart Mill was writing about the harm principle On Liberty, I struggle to believe that he could have conceived of a government with as wide a scope and a mandate as governments today have given themselves. So I don't think Mill could have possibly entertained the possibility of his harm principle being extended like this. He was a defender, at least in On Liberty, he was a defender of freedom. And I don't think On Liberty should be used to negate freedom to the extent that we're holding individuals down and injecting things into their bloodstreams that they don't want there. That can never qualify, in my view, as a liberal answer to anything. So that's more of the philosophical point, and I think liberals need to be careful going there. But the more practical point is this phenomenon where we're using government's own prior illiberal authoritarian conduct to justify further illiberal government conduct. And that is what the vaccine mandate or the vaccine passport is, by saying, look, we have this lockdown, which is a statist authoritarian government program. And the way to get rid of that is for mandatory vaccinations, which is a statist authoritarian government program. So it's a self-reinforcing loop that liberals tend to be very good at avoiding, to be honest. You won't easily find a liberal making the argument that that we need closed borders or very restricted immigration simply because government has a generous welfare policy, for instance, because that was government's own decision. We cannot now use government's own statist programs to justify further government statist programs. Now, I think liberals need to be careful here, and I think constitutionalists in general need to be careful here by saying, by empowering government more to solve the problems it created through its own expansive power in the past. So those are broadly my two arguments. I think that the liberal case, including liberal limited government, the rule of law, individual rights, militates very, very strongly against vaccine mandates, against vaccine passports, and that we kind of need to stay the course there rather than becoming too, for lack of a better word, too nuanced and too reactive to the peculiarities of our present situation, so as to really render our principles meaningless.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the arguments with the vaccine is, yes, it may be efficacious in terms of limiting the severity of COVID, that you might still be hospitalized, but you're less likely to die if you were previously vaccinated. But the real crux of the question is, does it improve or reduce chances of transmission to those who may not otherwise have it? But my response to that would be, well, then those people who are concerned about that risk themselves should be taking the vaccine. And I guess it is just a question of individual choice, right? People make all sorts of health-related choices with their lives, how much alcohol they drink or don't drink, how much fatty foods they eat. And, I think you also have to accept that sometimes people will make choices that are to the detriment of their health, but ultimately you do have to respect that.
Yeah, we need to accept that a liberal society is a risky society, especially with globalization. I mean, there was a time in the distant past where people lived separately as very small and quite inbred communities. But the moment you open up the door to people from around you coming into your society, you need to accept that a certain level of risk is going to come with that. When you're in society, it's risky. When you're in your house alone, like I am now, it's relatively safe. Now we need to decide, what do we want? Do we want a society, or do we want a very loose association of atoms or islands. I don't think anyone wants that, least of all liberals. Liberals, good capitalists like us, believe that there's a value to be had for the division of labor, and that simply means that we need people around us. And that means you could pick up the common cold, you could pick up TB, you could pick up COVID, any number of things from people around you. And the answer to regulating this relationship can never be, in my view at least, that we need this authoritarian institution in the center of it all, injecting people or directing their personal affairs in such a way that totally deprives them of really their self-ownership, which always starts with your body. And I must qualify what I'm saying here by the fact that I'm very pro-vaccine. I'm not anti-vax or anything like that. I plan to get the vaccine myself. I think the evidence shows it's quite efficacious. So by all means, get the vaccine. But the moment you go down this road of thinking, hey, it's actually okay to start holding people down and injecting them with something they don't want, or doing that indirectly by cutting them off from society in such a way that they cannot see their family, they cannot go out to the store to buy groceries, so that they're persuaded to voluntarily get the vaccine. Even that is really unacceptable in a liberal, spontaneously organized society.
Yeah, and one of the themes of this podcast is the problems with overly centralized policymaking. And so even if something may be beneficial to the majority of the population, it's very difficult for bureaucrats or politicians to make that determination. You also set a precedent, so there might be a second order effect down the line if there is this precedent for intervening so dramatically in people's individual choices, then other mistakes could be made. And usually if something is a good idea, if it's efficacious, the market will determine that, will reveal that information. Consumers will then go and voluntarily do that. And I think, like you argued in your article, there's almost no instances of 100% vaccination. The idea that we can fully vaccinate the entire population is, I think, misleading. And also the idea that we can fully defeat COVID is also misleading. It seems to me that COVID is going to be with us for many, many years to come. It's just a question of how we manage and mitigate that risk rather than try to eliminate it entirely.
Yeah, I mean, life needs to go on, even though COVID is around. We cannot suspend our lives. And that means we need to find out how we can have a liberal arrangement, but also be cautious about a very real public health danger. And I think the answer to that simply is always going to be personal responsibility. That is going to be the liberal and I think the prudent answer to this issue. People need to decide for themselves. And I mean, a lot of people bring up the argument that it's a favorite go-to argument that we've accepted in principle the yellow fever inculcation when people travel to some parts of Africa. I've got the yellow fever inculcation, and I mean, does that mean I'm okay with extending that principle from this limited group of travelers who go specifically to Africa? They're in a specific economic class. Do I support extending that to children in kindergarten who are now being vaccinated in some parts of the world, all the way through the relatively the groups that are not as at risk, and to people who simply object, people who would never get the yellow fever vaccine because they're never going to travel and they're fine with that? Do I accept that even they now need to be vaccinated against COVID against their will? No, of course not. And the fact of the matter is, I would have gotten the yellow fever vaccine anyway, even if it wasn't enforced. If I knew that I could get this terrible disease in Nigeria or in Kenya, I would get it myself without the government telling me to. So that's really besides the point. Liberals believe in the persuasion society, not the permission society. And if you need to convince people that it's better for you to get the vaccine, and that persuasion has been remarkably successful around the world. I think 73% of South Africans want to get the vaccine. So it's not like we're sitting here telling each other, my goodness, no one's getting vaccinated. No one wants to get vaccinated. It's a disaster. People want to get vaccinated. The majority of people want to get vaccinated. And that's something we should celebrate. And we don't celebrate that or honor the prudence of society by forcing the minority of conscientious objectors and religious objectors and people with other medical conditions who are concerned about vaccinating, by forcing them to get it. No, we should celebrate and be happy about the fact that most people want to get vaccinated, and we need to respect the wishes of the minority as well.
One of the things that's characterized the COVID response from many governments, including South Africa's, is the increase in executive power and essentially governments ruling by regulatory fiat. And in your book, The Constitution and the Rule of Law, which I recommend everyone check out, you highlighted the importance of the rule of law for a liberal society. Could you explain why the rule of law is important, Martin?
Yeah, so it's extremely important for a very liberal reason, and that is that you cannot be expected as an individual, as a community, whatever, to comply with laws and edicts that you had no role in formulating. The popular saying is "nothing about us without us." That's the same place where no taxation without representation comes from. So if you are in this country and you're expected to comply with BEE laws, with road traffic standards, that is because you have opted into the system. You have voted for someone, or you have accepted the political dispensation, and you are benefiting from it, etc. Now that happens through the legislature. Our indirectly elected representatives, in theory, go there with a mandate from their constituencies, from their supporters, to shape the law in the country as the people want it. That is the essence of democracy. That's the essence of popular rule. Now, the moment you have officials and functionaries in the basements of Pretoria who no one knows, who no one can hold accountable, basically shooting law from the hip, then you really destroy the democratic system in substance. Now, this is a global phenomenon, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's essentially from the turn of the previous century, we've increasingly had, for lack of a better term, the welfare administrative state, where the argument goes from legal thinkers that society has become so complex, globalization, commerce, larger populations, that we simply cannot have parliament discussing everything anymore. So parliament delegates a part of its legislative authority to the executive, who may then rule by regulation. Now, this is a very insidious point that I don't think we should concede even a little bit. I think if Parliament wants to solve a problem, then it better well meet. It shouldn't make its logistical difficulties the problem of free individuals in society. So if Parliament wants something done, it needs to do it. But that has not been the case, and that's certainly not been the case in South Africa, and certainly not now with COVID. So the Disaster Management Act has, I believe, two clauses. I think it's 2702 and then 52 provisions that essentially gives a plenary authority to the Minister of Cooperative Governance to just make law. Now, it doesn't say that in the act, but that's effectively what it means. It says the minister may, if they deem it necessary, blah, 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 to control public health, enact regulations. And this has been interpreted, and I think the courts accept it as such, that the minister can essentially make any type of law. And we've seen this. Banned certain types of chicken, warm food from garages, sandals. You can't stand within 2 meters of each other on paper. Taxi windows need to be open. All these things are matters of substantive law. This is something that you need an act of parliament for to ban it, because this is really this has to do with the freedom that we exercise on a day-by-day basis. It's not a technical thing that you could expect to see in a regulation. It's real law, and it's now totally out of the hands of Parliament. We see the minister, several ministers, publishing these thick packets of regulations for their industries, for the whole of society, very much regimenting how we are to behave. Now, where is democracy? Is there any democracy in that? What legitimacy does Minister Dlamini Zuma have to do this? You can say Parliament enacted the Disaster Management Act, but can you really say that Parliament received a mandate from the people of South Africa to bestow this type of awesome power on government? I don't think so. And in that, you have a collapse of the rule of law, because we don't have the rule of law now. We have the rule of man. We have the passing whims of a few ministers, a few officials, and their expert advisory panels really governing society. The law does not govern society anymore. It is the timeless principles of law that have come up from the spontaneous order of the common law and from best practice over centuries. That is nowhere to be seen. It is simply the diktat of certain functionaries who have made certain decisions in the last 2 years. So that is a total destruction of the rule of law. And what can we do to reverse that? I mean, a lot of people want to hear we need to launch this court case, or we need to do that simple answer. Unfortunately, it's far more difficult than that. And that is that as South Africans, as a global community of people, we really need to stand up and make our voice heard and say, no, this is not going to fly. We as a massive mass of the people who are expected to comply do not accept this. Now you can, that's most prominent at the ballot box. I would recommend everyone, I'm not apolitical, so I'd recommend everyone to go to the ballot box in November and choose a political party that believes in constitutionalism and liberty, and at least has committed itself to ending the excesses of lockdown. So that's one way to make your voice heard, but that's not the only way. Democracy is not only reserved for once every 5 years. We need to make our voices heard in between, and we've seen this with the government. When there is a pushback and the balance of forces are not in its favor, it steps back. We've seen this with many interventions, and we can see that with all interventions. And with lockdown, we can see that as well. But we haven't seen this pushback. And I would encourage us to stop accepting the premise of the deprivation of our freedom.
Yeah, and democracy is not only about elections, it's also about accountability. And it's incumbent on all of us as citizens to exercise that accountability and hold government in check. But I wanted to pick up on a theme related to what we've been discussing around liberalism and individual rights. And of course, individual rights are critical in any society, but we're also part of groups, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, families, communities at the local level, religious groups, linguistic groups. How do we understand that relationship between individuals and groups? As classical liberals tend to be quite skeptical of this idea of groups. They have rather vague edges and boundaries. And often those who seek to speak on behalf of a group tend to have maybe disproportionate power or representing the group in a particular way to advance their own sectional interests. But how do we understand this relationship between individuals and groups, Martin?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to note is that liberalism is not a world philosophy. It's not a world view. When I go to a restaurant, I don't choose the liberal items on the menu to eat. When I go to church, I don't go to a liberal church. It's strictly a political philosophy, and that is about regulating the use of public power or the use of coercive force in between people. That is what liberalism is concerned with. It does not provide answers to drug epidemics. It doesn't provide answers to any issues other than what the use of force should look like in that situation. So liberalism stands, I would say, agnostic against groups. Many liberals are, I guess you could say, very philosophically individualist in the sense that they reject the existence of groups entirely, per se. But then there are also liberals who are very upstanding and involved members of their communities who believe, and I think quite rightly, that individuals are very much products of their circumstances and their group contexts, just as much as the group and the community needs the individual to obviously perform certain crucial functions. So liberalism per se and classical liberalism stands very agnostic against this, but the role that liberalism plays in this discourse is that opting out of groups must always be allowed. You cannot keep someone in your group, in your community, and I think most decent people agree with that. And also that groups cannot impose themselves on other people outside of their group or other groups. Now, I think these are very uncontroversial things for me to say, but in practice, they have trouble translating into practice. And I mean, democracy, I guess, to an extent, is somewhat complicit in this, in that we don't have this opt-out function, and I think we need to rediscover the opting out function to a considerable extent more. If my local council, my local municipality is not providing me with the services that I want, then theoretically I should be able to opt out of that. That's the same liberal principle that says if you do not want to be part of a in rural KZN, that you should be able to leave without being kept against your will. It's the same principle. So liberalism comes back to the use of force, but it does not reject the incredible role that community plays in the liberal dispensation. I have a book here, Liberalism, its history, or something like that, from the 1950s. It's not a book about classical liberalism, but in its opening pages, it recognizes that one of the most crucial liberal functions is the intermediary institution. That is your church, that is your community, it's the family, it's all these things that exist between the lone individual and between the state. So these are liberal phenomena in the sense that those are the things that are going to protect freedom from the state. The state, in theory, according to liberal government principles, is the primary institution for the protection of freedom. But who protects the individual from the state if it decides to abuse that power? And this is the common criticism from communitarians. And they say liberalism does not have an answer to this. But liberalism's answer is the community. And it's always been the community. John Locke, and he said that the people can overthrow a tyrannical government. He did not mean that isolated individuals are going to take up arms. He certainly meant that they would do so as a collective effort. The Declaration of Independence in the United States said a very similar thing. Intermediary institutions have always been part of the liberal paradigm. And they play this crucial function in ensuring that, and I know one of your previous guests, Piet Leroux, talked about state proofing. And that is exactly what these intermediary institutions do. In South Africa, we have the brilliant example of solidarity. Them and their members were rightly concerned with the state of South Africa's higher education. And they established 2 universities on their own without using any type of force against anyone. They voluntarily went out, produced these 2 universities, Academia and Soltech. I believe they have smaller colleges as well for teachers and so forth. AfriForum saw that the police in South Africa were not doing their job. So they have a expansive neighborhood watch function that protects people from the excesses, the violent crime that everyone experiences on a day-by-day basis. All the Solidarity, AfriForum, Sakeliga, the IRR, the Free Market Foundation, all of them lobby against the excesses of government. So they play a very intermediary role. It's not the straw man, unfortunately, the myth that is peddled about liberalism, that there's this belief in these isolated individuals only standing up for themselves and relying exclusively on the state. That's simply not true. And I think we're in a good spot in South Africa as far as this is concerned, because we have these intermediary institutions. Other societies really do not have these institutions. Think of North Korea, think of many states in Africa. They simply do not have these institutions, and we do. We have real potential for ground up solutions to our troubles, and these solutions are being played out right in front of us by communities organizing peacefully. They're not attacking other communities. They're not infringing on the rights of other communities. They're doing things for themselves and for anyone who wants to associate with them. And I think that's an exemplary model that other societies around the world can look to South Africa to for how to deal with their troubles. So I think there's reason to be optimistic about that. Our political system is collapsing. Our economy isn't doing that great, but South Africans really are coming together within a liberal framework, not a state framework, but in a liberal communal framework, and helping each other and helping themselves.
Martin, I've noticed on social media some conservative voices in South Africa saying, well, this is all democracy's fault. All of the problems that we see in terms of state capacity and state failure, that's all because of democracy, and seemingly to imply that we need a bit more of an authoritarian model. What would you say to those voices and their criticisms of the democratic process?
So I think there's always a grain of truth there. Liberalism itself has a strong history of checking democracy. I'm very skeptical about people who want to associate democracy very closely with liberalism. From the start, from the days of Locke, it's been about limiting not only the power of the monarch and the despot, but also limiting the power of the majority, which, I mean, if you buy into, as you mentioned about the fuzzy edges of community, if you buy into the majoritarian argument, you're essentially just saying that the loudest voices, a minority within what is perceived as the majority, gets to dictate their opinions and their choices onto free people. So there, in a way, there is no such thing really as majority rule. So liberals, and this has been particularly about the liberal contributions of the rule of law and constitutionalism, has really been about checking the excesses of democracy. Now, this has not been perfected. There's still a lot to be done about really, especially about the scope of government. We've now both mentioned a few times, liberals believe that government has a relatively strict and defined mandate. Now in South Africa, we're obviously way beyond that. We have government providing healthcare, we have government dictating employment choices. That's obviously totally incompatible with the liberal approach to democracy. So those things need to be reined in from the liberal perspective. Now, to say that the troubles that South Africa has today are simply democratic, I think is a bit rich, really, coming from many communitarians, given the very close affinity that communitarianism, which I might add is originally a leftist school of thought, has with democracy. So it's quite interesting that you have these criticisms against liberal democracy coming from people whose philosophy is actually far more democratic than liberalism is. And I use democratic there in a very ungrounded and majoritarian sense, rather than the substantive democracy that liberals believe in, the defined democracy, the democracy that exists precisely to ensure that there is no concentration of power in the hands of a single individual or in an oligarchy. That is the liberal approach to democracy. It uses democracy to limit the power of the state. It has never used democracy to give a voice to those who wish to undermine minority interests or the interests of certain communities, which is what communitarian principles would achieve on their own. So I'm skeptical of these arguments. I published another article in the Rational Standard just this week, talking specifically to this issue in the context of South African history, and it's something that needs to be very critically approached. Liberals have favored federalism and decentralization in South Africa quite consistently, at least since the middle of the previous century. So it's never been a centralizing or a unitary approach to politics. It's always been a decentralized approach to democracy itself as well. And this is to ensure that the state is limited through the democratic process. And that is the liberal approach to democracy, as opposed to the force-centric communitarian approach, where you will have these the pretense of the community deciding, but in fact, simply a few prominent and powerful individuals within that community simply imposing their preferences on other communities and on people who even want to opt out of that community. And that's poison to the liberal approach to government.
So, Martin, in many respects, South Africa is a leading indicator for what's happening around the world. You have this increased tendency to centralize, but also a breakdown in state capacity, and also communities taking it upon themselves to self-organize and to create almost parallel institutions. And, I think that process of decentralization, of distributing power is such a key and recurring theme of this podcast. So where do you see South Africa going into the medium to long term, Martin? Do you think that there is a bright future for liberalism in South Africa?
So I think there's a bright future for liberalism always anywhere around the world. I think that you can never destroy the individual's desire for freedom, no matter how they vote, no matter what they say. At the end of the day, every individual really would prefer to be left alone on at least a certain range of things that they want to make decisions about. So I think liberalism, even though it only came about with John Locke as an organized ideological approach to politics, liberalism has always been part and parcel of the human condition, I would say, since we've had organized societies. It's always been there. It's always been latent. People want to be free. So I think never be too doom and gloom about the prospects of freedom. I think freedom is always within reach. We've had significant hiccups throughout history to a free society, but I think history shows us that there's a trend in favor of more liberty. And I mean, the fact that we're living it today shows that. I don't think at any point in human history have we been as free as we are now. And I think there's a trend. So I think there are prospects, and specifically applied to South Africa, I think that the chances of us retaining a unitary South Africa as it's been governed since 1910 are very slim. I don't think that even if there's a changeover in government, that would be possible. I think we're going to see a lot of decentralization, specifically because the process has already started. You're not going to. There's a saying in international law, but mostly associated with the British Commonwealth, is that freedom once given cannot be taken away. And that's essentially to say that now we have communities organizing for themselves, we have self-reliance, and then you can almost start talking about overlapping sovereignties. It's gonna be very difficult, and I would say don't try it to take that away and reinvest that again in the state structure. So I don't think that's where we're going. The chances are we're going to keep an ANC national government for quite a while still, and if not that, it's going to be likely. And I'm not a political analyst, but this is my gut. We're probably going to see a coalition of the ANC and a far worse party like the EFF that's going to keep it in power in exchange for favors and ministerial posts. So that's my concern at the national level, and that means that the process of decentralization will continue. I think the upsurge in support for an independent Western Cape is going to lead to the ANC government having to concede on federalism at some point. You're not going to stem that tide for as long as the ANC governs nationally, alone or in coalition. And for as long as that tide is still, it's growing slowly, but it's growing nonetheless. There is going to come a point where the ANC will need to concede, and I think they will concede to a federal system in South Africa. So I think we're going to see that in the medium to long term. I would say I think it's not that far off that South Africa will federalize in some way. And hopefully that'll work. I'm very keen on federalism, and I have hope that would work, and that would apply the necessary incentives on the center, on the national government, to moderate itself a little bit, to abandon certain stupid courses of action, and that will create, again, a decentralized but unified South Africa. Now, if the federal experiment that I'm expecting will come about does not work, then I'm sure there will be balkanization in South Africa at some stage. I'm pretty sure of that. We have too many organized communities in South Africa for that not to happen. The reason we don't necessarily see that elsewhere in Africa, where there's more state collapse, is because those African states don't have the type of civil society we have. I don't think the Western Cape will just allow the state to collapse and resign itself to that. I don't think very organized communities in KwaZulu-Natal will allow that. So my optimistic view is that we will get a federal solution within, I almost want to say within the next decade, and I'm keen on that working. I hope that will work. I have faith that it would work. But if not, we will balkanize, probably not in the next decade, but definitely within the next half a century. And I think both of those options are quite optimistic for liberty. I'm not seeing a communist dictatorship in South Africa or a fascist dictatorship in South Africa working. I don't think that's going to happen. We are going to have hiccups with our individual rights, but I think in the long term, whichever way you slice it, it's quite a positive story. Our economic prosperity might decline, but I think our freedom, it's only upwards from here if you look at it as a trend rather than as specific instances. So I'm quite optimistic in that sense.
Martin van Staden, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara. If you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and also leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there and also leave a 5-star review. It really helps the show to grow. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.